My favorite franchise sucks and I keep buying it. Why aren't I having fun anymore?
Well, I'm here to explain why. This isn't going to be another video complaining about how modern video games suck. This is going to be a video about the history of AAA games, why they used to be great, why they stopped being great, and why the model is ultimately doomed. But before we begin, I want to talk about my game, Healed to Death. It's a roguelike where you play as a healer. Keep your party alive as you explore dungeons, collect treasure, gear, and spells to face off against powerful bosses. If you enjoy roguelikes, Pikmin, ARPG necromancers, or MMORPG healing, this is a game worth checking out. It's still in early development, so go to the link down below and wishlist Healed to Death on Steam. Now back to the video. Throughout the 70s and 80s, each game was made by either one person or a small team with a tight deadline and the majority of costs being publishing, distribution, or marketing. The vast majority of games were made within a couple of months and sold to what was normally a loss, with the winners managing to keep most studios afloat. Because the technology at the time was so limited, there wasn't really much of a reason to increase the size of the development team. Games were just smaller in scope, so all the bases were covered with just a few people. It was really only in the 90s with the introduction of 16-bit gaming where you started to see studios really increase the size of the development team. As the technology got better and the possibilities of what a game could be kept expanding, the amount of people needed to make a cutting-edge product also grew. At this point in time, business leaders began to realize that the old model of making a bunch of games and hoping one of them was a hit wasn't viable anymore. The competition for technical supremacy basically meant that smaller scope games were duds by default, and that if you wanted to succeed, you needed to make something special. It was a time period where, business-wise, the objectively best way to make money was to make the best games. And this required both technical innovation as well as creative innovation. If you grew up during this period, you would call this the golden age of video games. And this is where we can finally get to the birth of AAA gaming. The market for video games was growing at a rapid pace. A bunch of technological innovations happened all around the same time, and this created a situation where games could be so much more than just a simple gameplay loop. The scope of a game was beginning to be more defined by the amount of developers you could put on a game rather than technical hardware limitations. This is where you started to see the first big blockbuster hits. Final Fantasy VII is widely viewed as the first real blockbuster AAA title. Getting Final Fantasy into the world of 3D wasn't enough, so they spent $40 million on CGI cutscenes, orchestrated music, and still making a massive yet still high quality RPG. And from there, more and more studios decided that this was the way to go. Each year, you would play multiple games that would redefine what gaming was at the time, and what it could be in the future. I have not met a single gamer who lived through this era, whether they be a late 40s Gen Xer or a young millennial, that doesn't look back at this period of time with pure excitement. We just thought that games would continually get larger and better forever, and nothing solidified this more than the changing landscape of the console wars. The console wars were originally fought over the graphical capabilities of the console. By the 6th generation of consoles, it started to become pretty clear that the real fight was actually over exclusives. What mattered most was which console had the best titles. And the titles that stood out were basically all high-budget AAA games trying to outdo each other. This came to its peak in the 7th generation of the console wars, where it was all about the exclusives and basically nothing about which cross-platform game was better on which console. And to this day, this has sort of remained the same. But something is changing and has been changing for a while. If I was to define the modern era of video games, it would be from 2012 onwards. And there is a reason for this. When the 8th generation of consoles started, it didn't feel that different from the 7th generation. The graphical improvements weren't that obvious for your average gamer, but what's worse is that the big budget games began to feel a bit samey, and worst of all, no longer an automatic improvement from the previous title. It was like you were playing the same game with a fresh coat of paint. And that's because you basically were. So much of the creativity during the golden age of gaming was just the result of overcoming technological limitations. Each game in the series would directly improve upon its predecessor because the technology was better. But when technology no longer becomes a barrier, the only real way to improve upon a sequel is to either take a massive creative risk, or to scale up the resources to make an even bigger game. And this is where we get to the tragedy of AAA games. We have had 12 years of the modern gaming landscape. I'm not going to pretend that there haven't been real technological improvements along the way. I'm also not going to pretend that AAA games have sucked in the past 12 years. A lot of them have actually been pretty good. But what I will say is that there are plenty of AAA games that still feel like a 2012 game with a shinier coat of paint. You could not possibly say this about games that came out in 2012 versus games that came out in 2000. And you certainly couldn't say this about games that came out in 2000 versus games that came out in 1988. AAA studios have predominantly chosen to scale up their production instead of taking real creative risks. This has led to a self-reinforcing loop that has further stifled innovation for the following reason. With the Insomniac leaks, you got an insight into what the financial situation of a AAA company is like. Insomniac makes really high quality games that sell millions. And despite this, they're only a little bit profitable. This is a major problem because the standard for them remaining profitable and in the green is to make games that basically have to be a Game of the Year contender. As a consumer, it's nice to have a situation where companies have to make good products to survive. The problem is that great companies are one screw up away from bankruptcy, and it's only a matter of time before an inevitable misstep. The only real reason a company like this can exist is because Sony wants big budget exclusives to give people a reason to buy a PlayStation. Outside of that, AAA studios like Insomniac are sort of on a knife's edge no matter how well they do. For this reason, they're sort of limited to what they can actually make, and I don't blame them. Taking risk to innovate on gameplay is basically alienating your core audience and then having to win them back over. It is much safer to just give them what you know they want and then add microtransactions to milk them. The standards people have is really low for IPs they have an emotional investment in. If what players care about in a sports simulation game is playing as their favorite sports star, then the company that has the right to use the likeliness of those stars has a monopoly that other studios can't really compete with. So there is zero reason to innovate on gameplay, and instead, they just milk the players in a sustainable way. Call of Duty is in a similar situation. It's basically the same game with no real consistent improvements. You could swap around the release order of most CODs and the players wouldn't even notice a difference. Assassin's Creed and Far Cry are at least different in some aspects from each other, but the gameplay loop is basically identical from one game to another. People still buy it, so why change? Pokemon is another big one. The games have been getting worse and worse since Gen 6, but this doesn't stop the fandom from buying everything Pokemon. The only real saving grace is that Pokemon is set up like the old Disney model, where the majority of profits comes from the merchandise. And by making bad games, they are basically starving the golden goose that is the engine behind the Pokemon IP. But until an entire generation of kids grows up seeing nothing but mediocrity, there won't be any real noticeable change in people's purchasing habits. IP loyalty is real. People just don't want to step outside their comfort zone nowadays, and as a company, why would you not exploit your customer base if you've got a valuable IP? People can complain all they want about cosmetics, loot boxes, battle passes, or whatever monetization system a developer implements. But so long as the majority of people that complain still buy the products, there isn't any real reason for a change. The future of AAA gaming is no longer about innovation. It's about taking an established IP, creating a live service game for that IP, and then milking the customer base. A story from Pirate Software was that a store mount from World of Warcraft generated more revenue than the entirety of StarCraft II Wings of Liberty. And this was back in 2010, where StarCraft II was massive. The transition away from a standalone box model was always going to happen. Activision has not been making objectively better games for a long time. But who cares when they've been reporting that revenue per player has only been going up? It's like the market went from a desire to expand their palate to just wanting a burger every day from the same couple of fast food joints. Modern AAA gaming is the equivalent of comfort food. You know what you're getting, it's never the best, but it's typically not awful. It just becomes really bland if all you play is AAA games. Fortunately though, the rest of the gaming industry is trying to fill the gaps that AAA has left behind. The indie market is taking the risks of experimentation. I'm creating Heal to Death to push the concepts of healer games. But I do understand that a lot of people still want the high production value of AAA without most of the BS that comes with it. I'm personally optimistic about the growth of medium-sized teams transitioning into specialized AA game studios. Larian Studios has blown up with Baldur's Gate 3, but throughout that time, they were slowly building up as a company that really knew how to make good CRPGs. I had played Divinity Original Sin 2 before Baldur's Gate, and it's literally in my top 10 games of all time. It was not that surprising to me that their next game managed to break through the core gaming barrier and become a massive market success. We are not yet in the era of specialized AA, but I think over the next decade, especially with all the layoffs in tech, you're going to see a lot more high quality games that can only be achieved by a dedicated team of specialists rather than a conglomerate that thinks they can throw money at a problem until it gets fixed. The reality is that software scales weirdly as you add more people. Games have hit the inflection point where more does not equal better. The burn and churn model of AAA games treating developers will show its consequences as artisanry begins to be more valued by gamers rather than pure scale and production value. I do think that an equilibrium will be found. AAA studios will exist, but they will never be the innovation juggernauts that they once were. The market that once made them like that no longer exists, and it has no signs of ever coming back.